The room was quiet, filled with that particular kind of English silence that feels almost polite, the kind that hides more than it reveals. A cup of cold tea sat untouched beside him, the rain tapping softly against the tall windows of his London home. At 73, Hugh Grant no longer seemed like the man who once charmed the world with his smile. The charm remained, yes, but behind it there was something else now, an ache, a wisdom born from disappointment. He leaned back in his chair, glanced briefly at the camera, and let out a sigh that sounded more like surrender than confession. Then, in that familiar dry voice the world had adored for decades, he said softly, "There are 5 people who broke my trust, and I never quite got it back." The interviewer hesitated, unsure whether to ask who they were. Grant smiled faintly, that half-smile the world had seen 1,000 times, but this time it carried no mischief, only exhaustion. He looked away, eyes drifting toward the rain outside. "It's funny," he murmured. "You spend your youth trusting everyone, and your old age trying to trust again." Those words lingered in the air, heavy yet graceful, like the pause between 2 piano notes. They weren't bitter, they were simply true. For decades, Hugh Grant had lived in the theater of public affection, adored by millions, misunderstood by most. To many, he was still the charming hero of Notting Hill, the eternal romantic. But the man sitting here now was someone else entirely, older, quieter, and marked by the cost of being both loved and betrayed. 5 faces haunted his memory, 5 moments that reshaped who he was. And one final truth, that trust, once broken, never fully heals. Long before the world called him charming, before the flash bulbs and velvet carpets, Hugh Grant was simply a boy who preferred the quiet corners of life. He was born in Hammersmith, West London, a district of narrow streets, soft rain, and a kind of gray gentleness that seemed to slow time itself. His father, a disciplined military man, carried the silence of duty. His mother, a teacher, carried the warmth of words. Between them, Hugh grew up in a house where affection was real, but rarely spoken aloud. He remembered the smell of his mother's perfume, the sound of her laughter blending with the kettle's whistle. Yet even in that comfort, there was distance, a polite restraint, the British kind of love that hides feeling beneath routine. It was in that house that Hugh learned to smile even when something hurt, to answer softly even when he wanted to shout. Trust to him became something fragile, something one must handle with gloves. At school, he was sharp, observant, and already gifted with that effortless wit that would later define his screen presence. But the charm came from necessity, not confidence. Humor became his survival. Whenever classmates mocked his shyness or awkwardness, he learned to turn embarrassment into laughter, to control how much of himself others could see. Behind the laughter, though, grew a quiet conviction that trust was dangerous and vulnerability always had a cost. When he found acting, he didn't chase fame. He chased escape. The stage allowed him to be anyone but himself, to hide behind words that weren't his. Yet every role he played, every smile he offered, was haunted by the same old instinct. Keep the truth at arm's length. Then came the day his mother fell ill. The woman who had been his anchor, his silent protector, was suddenly fading. Her death in 2001 would mark the true beginning of his solitude. "She was the only person I never doubted," he once said, and from that day forward, doubt became his most loyal companion. He carried it quietly. Through success, through love, through every applause. The world saw confidence, he felt caution, and so began his lifelong performance. Not in front of cameras, but behind his own guarded smile. London, in the late 1980s, was a city drenched in contradictions. Gray skies and neon dreams, ambition and fatigue. For Hugh Grant, it was both a battlefield and a mirror. He was 27 when he began to taste what success might feel like. Though it came in whispers, not waves. Small parts in television dramas, forgotten plays, low-budget films. All of them were small keys to doors that refused to open. And then came Maurice in 1987, a love story too brave for its time. His performance, tender and vulnerable, earned praise he did not expect. For the first time, the world looked at him with admiration, not amusement. But success for Hugh never felt like victory. It felt like exposure, the terrifying sense that people could finally see him. A few years later, 4 weddings and a funeral turned him into something he never wanted to be, a global phenomenon. The shy boy from Hammersmith became the face of British charm. His stammering, his half-smile, his awkward pauses all became trademarks that audiences adored. The film made him rich, famous, and, perhaps most dangerously, visible. Overnight, his life stopped belonging to him. He was called the perfect gentleman, the romantic ideal, the man every woman loved and every man wanted to be. But Hugh knew how fragile that image was. He had built it carefully, part truth, part invention. He feared that if anyone saw the real man behind the charm, they would leave. "I'm not as nice as I look," he would joke in interviews, masking truth with humor. Beneath every laugh was the tremor of a man quietly terrified of being misunderstood. The roles kept coming: Notting Hill, Sense, and Sensibility, about a boy. Each one deepened his legend, but also his loneliness. Fame gave him attention, but not intimacy. He once said, half in jest, "Everyone loves you until they know you." It was more confession than joke. With each passing year, he learned to perform off-screen as masterfully as he did on it. Red carpets, talk shows, award stages, all required a version of Hugh that smiled and sparkled, even when he wanted silence. But behind the curtain, he felt the weight of people's expectations. The endless demand for him to be charming, funny, light. He began to wonder if anyone would ever love him without the script. Then came the controversies, the kind that turned his name into headlines, the kind that tested both his reputation and his faith and loyalty. The world laughed, forgave, moved on, but he did not. In those years, something within him hardened. He stopped believing in appearances, stopped expecting honesty. The rise had given him everything, and quietly taken away his trust. Fame had made him immortal, but it had also made him invisible. Every ascent comes with its shadow, and for Hugh Grant, it arrived quietly. Not as a collapse, but as a slow unraveling. The public adored him, the studios depended on him, but inside he had begun to feel like a man acting out his own disappearance. Fame had built him a palace of mirrors, and every reflection was a lie. The first fracture came when trust met exposure. A private mistake, the kind everyone makes in moments of weakness, became public property. The tabloids circled like vultures. The headlines shouted with mockery, and the world that once called him England's golden boy now whispered with laughter. He faced the cameras, apologized with honesty, and smiled through the humiliation. But the wound it left ran deeper than the world would ever see. From that day forward, he understood that fame is not love. It is surveillance. People he had trusted for years began to vanish. Some sold his stories. Others simply stepped back, afraid that his downfall might stain them too. "You find out who your friends are," he said once, his voice colder than the words. "And it's rarely who you expected." That was the second fracture. Realizing that loyalty has an expiration date, he continued to work, to smile, to play the roles that made others forget. But he could not forget. Hollywood's forgiveness was quick, but its memory was long. Every meeting, every conversation carried that subtle reminder. You are charming, but broken. And then came the third rupture, quieter, more personal. His relationship, already fragile under the pressure of fame, began to fall apart. Love that once felt safe became performance. The same cameras that had made him a star now turned every gesture, every silence, into speculation. When it finally ended, he didn't shout, didn't cry. He simply withdrew into smaller roles, smaller circles, smaller words. By the time he turned 50, the man who once filled the screen with laughter had begun to vanish behind his own walls. Trust for him had become a luxury he could no longer afford. He had not yet named them, but 5 faces were already carved into the silence. 5 betrayals, 5 losses, 5 lessons in how even the kindest hearts can break. 5 names, 5 memories, 5 ghosts that never quite left the room. When Hugh Grant finally spoke about the people who had broken his trust, there was no bitterness in his tone, Only the calm clarity of a man who had lived long enough to stop pretending that pain disappears with time. They didn't just betray me, he once said quietly. They taught me what I could survive. The first was a friend, the kind of friend you make before success, before money and magazines start rewriting your story. They had been inseparable in the early days, two struggling actors with pockets empty but hearts full. They shared scripts, cheap whiskey, and a belief that honesty mattered. Years later, when Hugh's fame began to rise, that same friend sold a story about him to the tabloids, a small lie wrapped in a larger truth. It wasn't the betrayal itself that hurt most. It was the realization that everyone has a price, and sometimes the cost of fame is friendship. The second was a woman he had loved. Their relationship had begun in quiet, stolen evenings away from the world, laughter over burnt toast, promises whispered at dawn. She was clever, sharp, and saw through his charm in a way no one else dared. For a time, she made him believe that perhaps he could trust again. But love, when lived under a spotlight, bends easily under pressure. She grew tired of being the girlfriend of, and one day she left. Not with anger, but with absence. Years later, her interviews would turn his name into metaphor, his heart into headline. He never spoke ill of her. He only said, "Love doesn't end when someone walks away, but trust does." The third was a director, the man who had promised to protect his image, to guide his career with integrity. He became a mentor, a confidant, almost a father figure. But the industry has its own laws. Scripts were changed, contracts twisted, and one morning Hugh woke to see his private letters leaked, sold to the press as part of a publicity strategy. That was when he learned that in Hollywood, betrayal isn't a crime, it's currency. The fourth was the public, not the people who loved him, but the faceless audience who turned his mistakes into jokes, his apologies into memes. He forgave them outwardly, but a small part of him never forgot how quickly affection turns to mockery. He once said, "They wanted me to be charming, even when I was breaking." The trust between artist and audience, once sacred, had been replaced by a transaction, admiration in exchange for access. And then there was the fifth, the only one he could never truly escape, himself. In every interview, in every red carpet photograph, he saw a version of himself he had built to please others. The gentleman, the wit, the perfect Englishman. But behind that facade was a man who doubted his worth, who mistrusted praise, who had mastered irony so well it became his only form of honesty. "I wasn't lying to them," he admitted once. "I was lying to myself." He blamed himself for the friendships lost, for the women he hurt, for the nights when loneliness became his companion. He forgave others, but when he looked into the mirror, forgiveness never came. It was easier to joke, to charm, to hide behind that effortless humor. He was, after all, an expert in deflection. In the years that followed, he rebuilt quietly. He became a husband, a father, and found love that didn't demand perfection. Yet even now, trust remained a delicate thing, something he offered sparingly, like a rare gift. The people who broke it had long vanished from his life, but the lesson they left behind endured. He learned that trust is not about belief in others, but the courage to be seen without disguise. "You can't protect yourself from betrayal," he once told a friend. "You can only decide what it doesn't take from you." For Hugh Grant, forgiveness was never about erasing the past. It was about carrying it with grace. Those five people had shaped him, wounded him, taught him restraint, and in their absence, he found something quieter, rarer, and infinitely stronger: peace through acceptance. The world still remembered the charming smile, the quick wit, the cinematic love stories. But the man behind it had changed. He no longer sought approval, only truth, even when that truth came wrapped in silence. Now at 73, Hugh Grant moves through life like a man who has made peace with the noise. The fame remains, yes, but its power has faded, replaced by something quieter, almost tender. He spends most of his time between London and the countryside, avoiding premieres, favoring long walks with his wife and children. The man once defined by his wit now prefers silence, and perhaps that is the truest irony of all. There is a piano in his study, old and slightly out of tune. Some evenings he sits before it, pressing a few hesitant notes. The melody is never complete, always breaking off mid-phrase, as if he were speaking to ghosts he no longer blames. On the walls hang photographs, not of awards or movie sets, but of small, unguarded moments. His children laughing, his mother smiling from another life. Each frame a reminder that trust can fracture, yet love, if tended carefully, can still survive the cracks. He speaks rarely now, but when he does, his words carry the softness of hindsight. "I don't think trust ever comes back once it's gone," he said recently. But maybe that's not such a tragedy. Maybe it just teaches you to see people as they are, not as you wish they'd be. There was no bitterness in his voice, only understanding. The kind that arrives when pain has finally exhausted its sharpness. The boy from Hammersmith, the star of Notting Hill, the man who once smiled through scandal. They are all still here, folded into one quiet figure who no longer needs to perform. He has stopped trying to repair what was broken. Instead, he has learned to live inside the silence it left behind. The house grows dim as evening settles. He closes the piano lid, takes a deep breath, and lets the quiet surround him. Can a man who has lost faith in others still believe in love? Or does love, perhaps, begin only when we stop needing to be certain? Fade to black.